solely with their journal. Started in 1901 research in the journal called Lucy. So Russian language studying schools. All the rhetoric in there is all about whether I was really convincing you selling it, that they're doing this exact same parallels. Yes,
so you don't mind having this, or it's just
trust your gut too, to the extent you can do anything about it, right?
so maybe I would do it maybe here and then have like gender, or it's so mixed, or it's three of us and then two men.
I mean, maybe, yeah.
So you gave us an option.
Yeah, I'll just move it over here. Or maybe put it. try, but
Thank you so much. Yeah.
The ones Zsuzsa.
yeah, because we already like. Good days.
Yeah. Hey, no, it's boring. Okay. So,
Yeah, no. We have to prepare slides. I have the majority of them,
You already did. I saw them.
As it is looking
but I also started some quotations.
That's that I left you still. You know, this one for sure. This I was more noticeable today.
Five.
okay.
I think that intersection is
It's okay.
Okay. So, good afternoon, or good evening. Thank you very much for joining us at the event and full panel marking the 20th volume of the European Yearbook of Minority Issues. Good afternoon also to our online audience. Good afternoon from Cluj, HSE conference in Cluj. So we are very excited that we can share with you the info that the 20th volume of the European Yearbook of Minority Issues has been published recently, and we used the opportunity of the HSE conference in Cluj to discuss, to mark this 20th anniversary, but also to discuss of some developments in minority issues in more than 20 years. European Yearbook of Minority Issues is joint endeavor and joint program, product which encompasses variety of institutions. The leading one is European Center for Minority Issues, the leading partner in this consortium. We have additional partners, Eurac, Institute for Minority Studies and Federalism, who are also our main partner, University of Glasgow, as well Hungarian Academy of Sciences Institute for Social Sciences and for Minority Studies, ABO Academy, Finland, and also a very new partner, Romanian Institute for the Studies of Minority Issues, which we're happy also to be our hosts here, among also the University Babeș-Bolyai, which also served for many years as our partner. The book has been published by the Brill, which is also a partner institution, and I use this opportunity to thank the Lindy Melman, who has served for many years as our partner in the product and the book. Today we will discuss, I wanted to discuss and share with you some reflection on the topics which were presented in the 20 volumes. We will also after this have an exhibition. I really warmly want to thank our ECMI PM Stanislav Chenega, who is really very dedicated to producing the columns representing the main topics which we have discussed in the 20 volumes. And these topics, I also want some of the core issues I also want to discuss this evening with my distinguished guests. And I will now introduce them to you. Maybe it's also more also for our online audience. We have 4 panelists in this panel. Zsuzsa Csergő, professor of the Queen's University, and starting from September this year, the Sir Edward Peacock Professor of Nationalism and Democracy Studies. Professor Tove Malloy, Professor of European Studies at the Europa University at Flensburg and Global Studies at Roskilde University. Professor David Smith, Professor of Russian and East European Studies at University of Glasgow, and dear colleague and friend from Eurac, Sergiu Constantin, senior researcher at the Institute for Minority Studies, Eurac. And my name is Ljubica Djordjević. I'm senior researcher and head of Justice and Governance cluster at the European Center for Minority Issues. I would like to start this discussion by a short reflection of long 20-something years and your impression of if we would be now, how would it be with the yearbook, and what was can we have like a very brief flashback on the context in 2001 and maybe more enthusiasm and euphoria about minority issues? How this has changed, and could we have the similar volume at the first volume also now? What is the dynamics in minority studies, and how you see this development in minority issues, and what is your impression? Because usually when we assess minority issues and our success, then it's the usual comment is half glass full or progressive. So where are we also as academics, what are the changes when we look back into this more than 20 years now, and how you see these dynamics in researching minority issues and their effects? So, Dora, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to start because I'm probably the one who's been the longest with the yearbook in this room. But to think back at 2001, 2002, it was actually very much a moment like we are in today, now that I think about it, because at that time it was the conflicts and the post-conflicts in the Balkans. And the yearbook was very much informed at that time when it was founded by the situation and the post-conflict scenarios in the Balkans. And then it moved more towards diversity management and, of course, continued to focus on conflict mitigation.
It's on the phone.
Nice little interruption because we're actually going towards a more peaceful time in the middle of the 2000s with this approach of discussing much more diversity management and equality, non-discrimination, inclusive policies and so forth. And then of course came 2014 and the whole scenario changed again, and suddenly, for many, I think, also in this room, it was, oh, wait a minute, the world is still not fully peaceful. And for us in the yearbook, I remember that there was sort of a wake-up call. We need to go back and find some of our previous theories and research projects and so forth. And I think after February 2022, we are very much back where we were maybe in 2001, even more so. So I mean, just my quick take at the beginning of this.
What is your also serving now at the advisory committee? Maybe how you reflect.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of a recent event where it was attended by several members of the advisory committee, and you know, somebody made the point that if the glass was half empty before, after February last year, it's 3/4 empty. So obviously that's you know, there's been a marked decline in the kind of, you know, geopolitical context within which these issues are being discussed. There's been, I mean, I think looking back to the mid-2000s in some ways, I mean, early to mid-2000s, that was also the high watermark in some respects, in the sense that EU enlargement was still on the horizon. There was still a lot of talk about conditionality and consolidation of democracy, and I think after that, things unfortunately have been going backwards. But I mean, that I was struck by what Tove said about, you know, a different perspective on 2001, 2002, because obviously there've been like recurrent issues in the Western Balkans. I know they were very well, they seem to have been represented quite prominently throughout the 20 years of the yearbook. For example, there are also, you know, issues around, you know, Roma minorities that are still there, you know, so there's some degree of continuity. Yeah, I mean, I could stop there and come back.
Would you like, if you want to?
Yes, I mean, I would pick up from where David stopped. I was thinking about what was relevant, what were now the salient issues in 2001. Now, language rights. We're now after these waves of ratification of the No Council of Europe main conventions, now Framework Convention, the Charter, European Charter on Language, and then we had this now the moment of the big bang of the kin states engagement with the Hungarian status law, and then there were a lot of articles, you know, going around this issue of the kin state involvement. And that, of course, issues like political participation, equality. You mentioned, David, you know, the Roma minority issues, for example, that you see that these topics are somehow constant across these years that appear in various volumes. And I would say that if we start now, probably there will be also some topics or new or maybe different frame. I think now the kin state engagement would be, yeah, I mean, because there's also a lot of research already in kin state engagement. At the beginning of 2001, it was a kind of a new topic for scholars, for practitioners. Nowadays, we have a lot of research done on this, and I think probably this would be reflected in the way the articles that are now proposed in terms of kin state engagement are. Now we spoke the whole day about securitization. I think this was not really a topic that was discussed 20 years ago, or not at the level that is discussed now. So I think this is something that maybe would have been different. And then I think the issue of borders, looking back, I think borders were not somehow very present in 2001. I think that's my impression. I think that now, also because all this crisis brought back quite strongly this processes of rebordering. So despite the European integration, we see this kind of rebordering processes in migration crisis, COVID crisis, and so on and so forth. So I think borders somehow become quite relevant in the last period, and I hope there will be a much more focus on these issues related to borders and how borders impact minority communities in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Would you like to? Yes. So, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I have been one of the general editors for a number of years now. What I have noticed is that several of the issues that I also see discussed in Canada and the US, involving indigenous groups, for example, and also questions about introducing more of an element of giving voice to minority scholars, giving voice to minority actors, are also becoming more routinized in the conversations about minority issues. So it used to be in the 1990s, it was more of a focus on what European institutions can do. There was a lot of excitement about those two framework documents, and there were hopes among many minority-friendly actors that maybe something more is going to happen, and it's very interesting to see that 30 years later, those still remain the main documents because politics is so. So that's something that, as I think back to how we were thinking about minority issues, comes to mind that many people who were very active European actors at the time have been saying in the last number of years that was the 1990s was the decade of the minorities, decade of minority protection, and that this decade of minority protection, and later, as these countries became, many of the countries that we study have become EU member states, and those that are in the Western Balkans are coming in, have realized that the also about politics, and people are strategizing in various ways, and so it's very difficult to come up with documents that can be actually implemented. And so then there was more attention to the politics of it, I think. And but at the same time, I also noticed that we are talking more about the need to integrate minority actors, minority scholars, and I think that so it's not just people from the outside talking about who they are and what they're doing, but to have more of an interactive conversation. And I think that that's something we should welcome. And I see it also happening, especially vis-a-vis indigenous populations, indigenous groups in Canada.
Thank you. Also, this your comment, Zsuzsa, and also this three-quarter comment brought me to think whether the instruments of 90s are adequate and whether we need to find for some new approaches. And this is something that has been addressed in previous volumes of the yearbook about diversity management and whether these minority studies and these confirmations of majority, minority, and so whether we need to have some to think about new concepts and new approaches, or are these of the 90s, or are we stick in this euphoria of the 90s and this maybe not adequate? What is Europe? Have we reached some kind of European minorities, so standard in minority protection, and so on? We need to have to be more innovative and to search for some other models of diversity management in Europe, which are more adequate for the moment, and then maybe more successful.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking when you were speaking there, Zsuzsa, if you look at, there were the two, foundational instruments in the 1990s, and if you look at what's come out subsequently, most of it has been under the auspices of the OSCE, HCNM. So you've got the various sets of recommendations that I think map onto how concerns have evolved. So you've got the Lund recommendations, you've then got the Bolzano-Boson on minorities and interstate relations, and then you've got the Ljubljana guidelines, but they remain kind of recommendations and very much in the area of soft law. And I mean, at the EU level, you have, the Lisbon Treaty and the minority rights being kind of made foundational values of the EU, but, again, to what extent has that gone beyond making them anything other than a competence of, member states? And this morning we talked about the Minority Safe Pack initiative as something that showed there was still a kind of perceived need to go beyond that, to go beyond the current EU status quo. And I mean, I think, if you look at the Framework Convention, it remains very much a framework. It's hard to see any kind of, any prospect for deepening that at the moment. And, again, the general trend has been away from, it's been a stepping back in terms of protection, I would say, unfortunately. But I think, those instruments still, they still retain their value. I mean, I think you can, the activity of the advisory committee is one possible way of, encouraging dialogue between state authorities and minority stakeholders. If I think maybe there's a need to think of more imaginative ways to bring that about. There is one, the annual reporting is, I think, has kept its value in that respect. So, it's good to have it, and it's more a question of how, what the mechanisms that would make states take this a bit more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, some people that I have talked to lately are sort of indicating that maybe we are a little bit at a crossroads with the minority regime in Europe and with the previously what was considered the monitoring fatigue within countries. But now I have sensed a frustration both among scholars and practitioners that although we have some good conventions in the Council of Europe, we haven't seen any new countries signing up to them in a long, long time. And we're still missing France, and we're still missing Greece and a few other countries. And the same thing with the language charter, which is stuck. I mean, even though those countries that have looked into signing up to it have stopped. But we also have a situation after February 2022 where the High Commission on National Minorities in the OSCE is pretty much immobilized when it comes to the situation of course, in Russia, and therefore also a little bit in Central Asia. How much can he actually achieve? What is he going to do? Is he effective? So there is a sense, a beginning of a little bit of a change where people are saying, can we do more? So in a sense, I agree with you. There was also an attempt to propose an additional step to the Framework Convention, a commission to take petitions, but it wasn't presented in the end. But I was in contact with some scholars who actually put it together, some legal scholars. So there is a sense that maybe even us, the epistemic community, need to do something to move this on, because the countries are not, the member states are not moving it. It is definitely status quo, and maybe even retracting from where it was in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I think that could influence also on how the Yearbook could portray these issues. So this is my sense. Usually, I don't know if it's like that anymore.
Yeah, I would say that this discussion about new standards is very different depending on whom you speak with. At least this is the experience I have. And there's still clearly a certain feeling among strong, politically mobilized minorities across Europe that the two conventions, the Council of Europe, somehow reached their kind of potential. I mean, they seem that they believe that they cannot get much more out of these instruments. They will need something better, something different. And well, we have the example of the Minority Safepack initiative. So now I think this is the next battleground, basically, to move to the discussion about minority rights and to make it central within the European Union. So far, the first attempt, it was not successful. We'll see what will happen with the appeal at the final appeal at the European Court of Justice. But clearly, if you speak with this category of stakeholders, to use this term, this is basically the message we get. If you speak with, you mentioned the governments, the member states are clearly do not have this appetite of serving something new on this, from this point of view. There's the feeling that what we have is good enough, and there's also an argument that maybe we should try to make the monitoring process, to improve the monitoring process, to make it better, to I don't know, be more creative, as David said, and to find ways to implement or to help the state, the governments to implement their commitments. Because as I said, these are no legally binding commitments. While we have this, they are general, but still they must be implemented. And also, I mean, we have this soft law standards that I think can be also very useful. Of course, they are not legally binding. They can be useful in the sense that they are more detailed. They bring this additional, layer of protection which the framework convention, for example, the general wording of the framework convention and of the European Charter does not provide. And being just political commitments, they allow the states to play a bit with them. So, in case, I mean, you have these bilateral treaties which were very fashionable in the late 90s, and well, we can discuss how successful they were in the end. If you look at the record of the joint commissions established to implement or to monitor the implementation of the treaties, I think also we can speak about half empty, half full. But still, I think there are examples of countries that somehow made use of these soft law standards, and the advantage is that they have this kind of flexibility, allow the country to play a bit more with them than to commit to this legally binding standards that probably will put some governments in uncomfortable positions. So again, maybe an idea would be to try to make more use of this soft law instrument, which sometimes are considered as not really relevant because they are not legally binding.
Yes, so Sergiu mentioned the increased attention to borders, and I was thinking also that I am now in Flensburg, happy to be there just for a short period of time, and I hear it there, and it also came up in the discussion in an earlier panel that is a good practice example of two member states where there is a border and there are minorities on the two sides, and it is possible to reach the point where that is seen as a value. Diversity as a value is something that does not necessarily create fifth columns of the other state. And so I think that is something else that we can take away from research on minorities, and also quite a bit of it has been also discussed in issues of the Yearbook, is that in the context of what was mentioned as the security framework in the 2000s, minorities were seen as problems. And I am hoping that we are not going back to that time again when we have to explain to people that minorities will always be there. And do we want to live in a place in countries where there is no diversity, there are no minorities, where everything, the cultures are homogeneous, or, my own research has been on minority, majority, state minority conflict in non-violent environments. And I don't want to turn into a scholar of violent conflict. And I think conflict is normal. Conflict is necessary. The question is how conflict takes place, in what channels. And of course I'm going to say this, I'm a political scientist, but I think it matters that when conflict takes place through politics, and when that can happen, instead of bringing in the coercive apparatus and armies and whatnot, that's not a bad thing. It actually it can be a driver of good change. And so I think that is something that we have to keep bringing back, that we should be looking at minorities and minority members as ordinary people who have ordinary needs and claims, and who are structurally disadvantaged in democracies. They have to be, it's about numbers. But they have ordinary needs. And so how can we make it work? And I think that these examples, these good practice examples, like the ones across the Danish-German border, maybe we could talk about a little more, because there has been a lot of focus on Eastern Europe, and especially those cases of violence and post-violence, and of course we need to talk about that. But the reason is that we want post-violence to be a rebuilding period. So we know that war is terrible not only for the destruction it does in that moment, but because everything changes afterwards, right? So even everything changes. And so we have to pay attention to what is possible after violent conflict. And we need to, I think, focus on cases that are non-violent conflicts. Maybe there were at some point, but they're not. They haven't been in the last. And those are the cases from where we can learn.
Continue a bit, I think, because this reminds me of, I think, an interesting point also related to the standards. So it brings together the last two arguments is that, yeah, well, borders can be, something that creates, distance between communities, between countries, but can also be, it's like the point of contact, the point of cooperation, bringing together as well, depending how you make use of them. And speaking about the new standards, or what can be done differently or new, I mean, you can also bring minority issues to the back door using the cross-border cooperation. And this is an interesting, I think, development lately with this new EU instrument, the EGTC, the European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation. So this is interesting. It's an interesting instrument. Of course, it's not meant to be, the design is not for minority protection or minority cross-border cooperation. The main aim is not to contribute to strengthen the social cohesion, the economic cohesion, all these economic, let's say, priorities of the European Union. However, it can be used, and it is used by minority communities in border regions to cooperate. So they are example of such European grouping of federal corporations, which have a quite strong, let's say, minority-related dimension, elements. They use minority languages on both sides of the border. They cooperate. I know schools from the two sides of the border cooperate, and so on and so forth. And so I think this is something new. I mean, and what is most important is this instrument is not only available to the EU member state, but also to non-EU member states. So this can be established with partners, EU member states plus non-EU member states. For example, there is one involving Ukraine, Ukraine and Hungary. And so, yeah, this is something quite new. And, well, in current context, probably is not functioning very well. But before the Russian invasion, as far as I know, with the limits, of course, because there are still problems. I cannot bring a better example, or a better functioning example is the one involving South Tyrol in Austria and Trentino, which I know very well because it's the region where I'm living in. So, but the idea is that this is something new and it has potential and is not used or fully used in certain border areas where I think could be quite useful as well.
Yeah, no, just to I couldn't agree more. It's important to highlight those good practice examples and keep those instruments in mind, and keep the interests of borderland communities, the voices of minorities at the forefront. Because I mean, you talked before about. Does it just do that when I'm talking now? As you talked about the rebordering, the rebordering trends, the unfortunate practices we saw in COVID very recently, but also going back, with kind of external crises in the Middle East, the arrival of large numbers of refugees, that suddenly you saw the reimposition of border controls that really, really disrupted what had become, well-functioning cross-border arrangements. But just as another reflection, I mean, I think part of the problem here is the kind of wider, you could say, crisis of legitimacy of liberal democratic institutions post 2008, on the back of the economic crisis, and how that has, we see, across the whole of Europe, we see a kind of recession of liberal democracy, and that, of course, liberal democracy is a crucial enabling context for these kind of instruments and practices. So that's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Churchill who said the conflict is never wasted. It's the beginning of a new idea. And I understand your excitement about the Danish-German border region. It's a big discussion there. Can we be an example for the rest of the world? And I think I can mention a couple of scholars who would be skeptical, including myself. But there are lessons to be learned, and there's just a book out last year on what happened when Germany annexed a big chunk of Denmark back in 1864, and what happened with the assimilation policies and what have you, and how then that was first exerted or on the minorities, of course, and then when the land was given back, how new structures were then set up that, in a sense, took into consideration that there was a new minority, and there were still people from both groups living in this piece of land which had gone back and forth. And I remember reading it and thinking, this is something which, it was many historians writing, and this is something which we need to keep in mind when Russians leave the Donbass, that there will be these processes for many, many years to come, that also can then be, I don't know if knowledge can be transferred, but it's something which we need to monitor in terms of research and publications and experts on monitoring this. But having said that, I am still very skeptical about these soft law instruments. I mean, they come from the High Commissioner on National Minorities. The OEC is immobilized at the moment. I think it's up to them then to show how these soft law instruments actually have a value, especially at the moment. And why don't we hear more about that? I mean, how many people actually know about these instruments? How many people, civil servants, know about these instruments and use them in their daily work? Some of the things that I think the Office of the High Commissioner could look into and start telling us. How are they disseminated? I mean, they're disseminated to us. We all know very much about them. But I don't know how many people in Transcarpathia knew this, even before the crisis, before the invasion. So, and they're, of course, very valuable for trans-border cooperation also. So, I'm still very skeptical. And I have spent many years of monitoring, and I have sat across, I don't know how many officials promising, green fields and all the sunshine, and then once you leave and you're off to the airport, it's like, let's put it into the drawer again. So I'm just saying, we are not in the euphoria we were in the 90s. And in the early 2000s, we were still carrying on this euphoria, and we started the monitoring, and we saw how the early high commissioners, how they were actually functioning in the Baltic states. There were good results, I think. But now, and then, yes, I mean, then we have the EU, the big player that is supposed to make everybody happy. But it's not making people happy in the Balkans. And I'm sure you can chip in on this, how the fourth Copenhagen criteria is basically blocking everything. And I think this is something we need to talk more about, also in the yearbook regime and scenario, because we don't see, or I don't see that the Balkans are going to sit back and accept that Moldova and Ukraine are just going to come in and get the red carpet. And then you have all the countries in the Balkans that for 20 years have tried to adapt and adjust, and they're still being kept out. I mean, I think we're up for some really turmoil in this in the coming years. Definitely. And we need all antennas out. We need to research it, we need to write about it, we need to make it public, we need to make it open. Because in the European Commission, like, they don't see it.
Yeah. But speaking of soft law and hard law and the role of international organizations, so bring me to the question of how there is also this usual statement that we're in a crisis of multi-level governance, and that it's more like bilateralism and not multilateralism, and can we make a change if now countries go again to another wave of nationalization and not so how you assess the role of international organizations and this diplomacy and politicization and in minority issues at the moment?
Well, I'm happy to talk about that because I just read a very negative assessment of that. Of course, EU being one, but you also see it in the Council of Europe. In fact, we've seen it since 2008 and the quick war in Georgia, how the interstate relations take over, and based on kin-state issues. But basically they block where they can. In the Committee of Ministers in the Council of Europe, they block, and it's always kin-state issues. You can look it up. I think also we have some articles about this in the yearbook. And this is, of course, what is happening with the fourth cognitive frontier in the Balkans. So and then you can take it to the Security Council and all this. I mean, what is working? I'm rather.
One way of maybe asking that question is what makes minorities resilient, in the sense that resilient also to a kind of kin-state engagement intrusion that might capture them, capture their institutions, demobilize, weaken essentially their ability, their investment into democracy and into feeling like they can have a good life where they are. And I think that that's essentially, that's a very simple way of phrasing it, but if minorities matter, then we would want minorities to have a good life where they live. And for that, they usually need some network of institutions that do both bonding and bridging, right? So the kind of bonding that allows them to have develop minority cultures, and not just to preserve and dance in folk costumes. There's nothing wrong with that. But so that they're not just preserving something that's the past, but they can actually have a life as, social life, minority life where they live. And at the same time also, to have these connecting associations with majority as well. So there can be interaction that creates solidarity and social resilience in the end, that prevents ethnic cleavages to become deeper. And unfortunately, there is war and violence create cleavages and deepen cleavages. It was mentioned earlier, Myra mentioned it as well, that this comes out from the research of those, not mine, but those who have been studying violent cases, that it's the other way around from the way some of the international relations, old school international relations scholars have been saying that if there is some diversity, then that turns into violence at some point. And what the scholarship shows us is that it's actually the other way around. When political elites who strategize through using violence, they create those cleavages, and then once violence happened, especially like war, let alone genocide, like in Bosnia or Rwanda or other cases, then nothing is going to be exactly nothing's going to be as easily possible and mendable as before. So that should be prevented. And I think it may sound provocative, a resilient minority, but I think that's what we should be looking for, minorities that are resilient to king states that want to weaken them and capture them. And so maybe if their home states are more attractive and help them have a good life, then that's less of a problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's true, but increasingly, I think it highlights the need to work with majorities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's where a lot of the effort should be. Because I mean, I think about the Framework Convention and the scope of application, and the fact that states would like to limit that to officially recognised minority groups, but there are various articles that have kind of universal application, like Article 4, effective equality, but I'm thinking of Article 6 on intercultural dialogue, fostering tolerance, Article 12, which does that in relation to education, and increasingly, I mean, based on my limited experience so far of the monitoring, those issues are coming more and more to the fore. And it goes back to what I said about the decline in the overall sort of political and societal climate. So that's an important thing, is to try and build a more kind of inclusive, more tolerant attitude. And as you say, that includes working with the political elites of the majority to try and get them to be more proactive in that direction.
Yeah, just a few thoughts about this, the role of the national organizations. And well, national organizations are the member states, so they react as their members react. So of course, when the overall situation is one of not us versus them, of no states that do not even manage to agree on basic things, then they are supposed to work in organizations. Of course, these organizations will not work themselves. This is what we witness nowadays. No? However, I think it's better to have them than not to have them, even if they are sometimes we all get sick and tired of what they are doing, what is their role. It doesn't seem that they bring this contribution that most of us want from them, to make things better. And of course, so that without them probably worse. So this is my assessment. There are periods in which probably they are performing better, and periods in which the blockage is more, let's say, a common feature of their working. But in general, I think, if you put in balance without them or with them, I would definitely think that it's good to have them. And speaking about these social standards, I fully understand your skepticism about it, and definitely this is something that, as I said, it depends again very much on the state themselves. They can choose to make use in a good way of them or not. And I think that they are also useful because as being, let's say, not legally binding, the states are more ready to at least maybe initially formally said, yes, we agree with this. Maybe not to be fully convinced about this soft law standard at the beginning, but maybe also the kind of process of learning. So seeing that in fact other countries are using them, and in fact they might solve some issues, and said, well, why not? We have them. We can maybe use them. I mean, and I think they can also bring to the fore certain issues which are now relevant for our societies. For example, now we have our lives a lot taking place online, and I'm thinking about this latest guidelines of the High Commissioner on media, media in the age of information technology. something that it's very specific, it's also technical, but it's very relevant for minorities. And this is the only, as far as I know, it's a soft law instrument, but the only one that offers guidelines to the states when it comes to this specific issue, which is very relevant for the world we are living in now. Without having this, we will have no standard at all on this.
Well, the EU is adopting standards. Yeah, I mean, after all, most of these recommendations are written by us, the academic community. So, of course, I like the document, but I just don't see that the states use them. I mean, I can speak of Scandinavia, and I dare say not very many people know what the OECD recommendations are in Scandinavia, not outside the foreign ministry's office for the OECD. I mean,
but this is the problem of the OSCE. I mean, is the fault of OSCE, or they should do information campaigns in Scandinavian countries about these instruments?
yeah, they should. They probably should. But
Isn't it maybe minority issues are considered like Eastern European issue, and then
another question.
we can then maybe discuss it, because also when you look into the yearbook with the national cases, it's usually in the East, and then we struggle finding authors and cases for Western part. And why are we still in this First World War paradigm that minorities are, or questions are in this, and how is with the West?
Really, what was the sentiment in Copenhagen in 1993? And I don't think it has changed much, to be honest.
And this diversity management in West is also its challenges, but it's also another question of old and new minorities and so on and so forth.
Then maybe Northern Ireland should be in the East.
Yeah, probably members of the Central Eastern Europe. We accept that. Or brothers.
That is your new thought too.
Let me take that.
I mean,
Yes.
no, I mean, I'm sorry, maybe it's just my personal impression, but I was looking back over the content of the whole set of issues, and it felt to me that there was actually quite a good geographic spread. I mean, I remember doing, articles on Northern Ireland, on Scotland, Scottish devolution and the independence referendum in 2014. For instance, so that spread did seem to be. I mean, admittedly, yes, if you counted them up, there'd probably be more on Central and Eastern Europe, but the kind of generic issues that all societies are facing, I think they have been in there. And one thing I really liked was also, not infrequent reference to non-European cases as well. So there was that wider perspective, which I think is very valuable.
Yeah.
And it takes you into colonisation.
I remember some editor meetings where we have talked about the fact that we should focus more on Western Europe also. The problem has been then that it oftentimes would be Scotland and Catalonia and those issues, rather than maybe more what are the broad scale, general minority policies that countries implement. Of course, especially language policies and so forth that sometimes we don't know about. Holland, the Netherlands, do they have any minority policy?
Which region?
Yeah.
Well, in French, New Caledonia, and now became a bit more came to the spotlight because of the referendums on the status of New Caledonia. It was already there before, and speaking about New Caledonia, I mean, it's called the European Yearbook. And remember, we had a discussion, okay, it's called European Yearbook, should we maybe also take in papers focusing on cases or issues that are relevant for non-European context? And well, there are some, but I think maybe now speaking about moving the discussion towards like the future. We spoke about past, now speaking about the future. I think would be useful, and personally I would like to have also this non-European presence more evident. I mean, there are certain topics that are not so much discussed in Europe, but are discussed more outside Europe, but are relevant for Europe. And you mentioned indigenous peoples. No? And I think, I mean, if you follow with the news, speaking about Scandinavian countries, there are quite serious problems about the non-Sami people in Finland. There are this really serious discussion about this new legislation regarding Sami land rights in Sweden and in Norway as well. So then, of course, there are issues in Greenland as well. And having this kind of, scholarly articles on indigenous peoples, bringing in also the Canadian experience. So I don't know, even South American, something that is quite, to be honest, ignored in Europe. No, the indigenous peoples in South America. I think it would be interesting and enriching also the way we look at the indigenous people's situation in Europe. And,
I think also that the yearbook could maybe look at some of these, in some of the post-colonial settings, you have some interesting constitutions, which are not necessarily rights-based, but more community-based. And you have Bolivia and some of the South American countries, Indonesia, what have you. It could be interesting maybe to look at how in the post-colonial setting legal pluralism is much more accepted than it is in Europe, and how that influences the way that communities then navigate themselves in the system of these constitutional settings where they have to speak for the group rather than the individual, because this is what we sort of do in liberal democracy. But many of them have retained the legal pluralism approach, and it's fully accepted. So I think we could learn.
Maybe there could be a special section on what Europeans could learn from the rest of the world.
Absolutely, and what you can learn from those constitutions that are put together differently, like
Yeah, it's often the European model or models are criticized as being Eurocentric, but Europeans are very Eurocentric. Because yeah.
One of the managing editors. I work on this section on national development together with Tomas. Although this year I'm working on a special section on the impact of the war in Ukraine on minorities. And I think this discussion was actually very useful in terms of identifying themes for articles which we can commission. And I think that what I find most valuable about the yearbook is the meeting which we have every year in September with the regional editors, because we have these kind of discussions. But it also made me realize that being a yearbook, we tend to focus in our discussions on what has happened in the past year. So we say, what should we cover in the yearbook this year? What was the war in Ukraine? And before that, it was, COVID. And I think maybe we need to think about the broader picture, like we did today. When you ask, which is different today compared to 20 years ago, to have more of a long durée approach, maybe we can call it, to see what the critical junctures are, what the main deadlocks are, what are the, some of the creative solutions in the implementation of minority rights. And And then to try to focus on those, to have more cutting-edge articles instead of, to try to push more the debate on solutions and ways forward. And the other suggestion that I had for the future is to involve the general editors more as well, because when the yearbook was established, scholars like Francesco Palermo and Rainer Hoffman, they were kind of the initiators of the yearbook, but they were also writing articles which were extremely valuable. And I remember when I was doing my PhD, it was like the Bible, and maybe it is a little bit less so now. So if you can bring in some of the general editors to maybe co-author with the PhD students, I think it's also an important aspect of the yearbook, that there are both young scholars and more established scholars.
Yeah, if I may, just to pick up on that point about looking at kind of, rather than being kind of reactive in a sense, but looking at kind of long durée developments. And I was thinking again about digital media and picking up on what you said, Sergio, about highlighting the kind of positive possibilities that this opens. I mean, rather than thinking about, well, how do you combat kind of hate speech in the digital sphere and affected polarization? I mean, that is crucial, of course, but also looking at positive, innovative approaches that have been developed. And I'm thinking about talking to someone from one particular kin minority community, and they said that the newspaper that they publish has gone entirely online, and they've downgraded it to 2 issues a week. And on the face of it, people might think, oh, this is terrible, you're cutting back on your provision. But they said, actually, no, this is a conscious business model decision, because, yes, it only comes out twice a week, but the number of people reading it online, our readership has, not only, I think, quadrupled or more. And they said, and people are now monitoring the readership online, and it's picking up readers across the border as well in the kin state. So if you're talking about ways of developing these cross-border frameworks and working innovatively with digital media, they're the kind of, you can put a more positive spin on that in a way. And just if I could, one other thing that struck me reading, looking back over the content, and this also speaks to what you were saying, Federica. I noticed in the early days there used to be a kind of regular, what has the HCNM been doing this year, what has the advisory committee been doing. That seems to have fallen away, and it might be nice to think about reviving it and talking again, not just about the problems, but the kind of some of the positive initiatives that are being done, like the redrafting of thematic commentaries, and that are supposed to give exemplified best practice examples, but also I'm thinking Council of Europe and the recent establishment of the laboratory on history teaching. And you go back to the importance of education, of kind of dealing with like conflictual politics of history and memory. Something around that, I think, would be very valuable.
Just a comment, there's still international relation reports section, but it's only restructured. It's not by institution, but by topic.
I'm thinking that that's actually a good idea, because it's one way of holding those institutions accountable, right? To show, so it would be a summary report of what they have done, and imagine nothing in 2002.
One word, nothing.
Yeah, and sending it to them, and that, I don't know, maybe a reminder of the need for that.
That was actually the reason why it was changed the topic, because for some institutions it was nothing. So we can just maybe before I open the floor to other participants, how do you generally assess academic publishing in minority issues and the position and role of one yearbook in this? How do you see what we have criticized a bit international organizations is how we self-assess our contributions, so and then the position of our yearbook in that.
I can start criticizing. Okay, so I think overall it's really an excellent opportunity for, especially for at least now for younger researchers to publish their work. And now I come to the criticizing part. The problem is that it's not really easily accessible. So it's not available online. It costs a lot, and yeah, probably as a student you will not buy this book. If your university does not buy it, you will not have access to it, and your paper will not be known, basically. So this is collectively a point of maybe we all know, because we had a discussion with the editor several times, and this is something that definitely we should try to change. I mean, also you mentioned scholar like Palermo, Rainer Hoffman, so it's not only for young researchers, it's for senior or experts in this field. But again, this is something that probably does not appeal so much because the publication time is also very long. So we speak about year to year, but it takes quite a long time from the moment somebody submits the manuscript to the moment that the issue itself is published. So yeah, this might be, but again, this is some internal discussion that we keep having about how to try to make this better. So yeah, I would say that you can also think maybe having in mind the idea that we are a team, how we can make better use of what is already published, and because there are 20 years of scholarly articles, and would be, I think, for myself, for example, would be very interesting to have maybe, if this will be available in the future sometimes online, to have a kind of focus on some kind of thematic focus on topics, to see what was published on language rights in the yearbook over 20 years, to see what is changed or how it changed, how this topic evolved, how the research, what the outcomes of the research on this evolved, and to do some conclusions. So to have this kind of long-term assessment of language rights research. And so this can be done thematically. Also can, for some countries, might be also interesting to have countries to kind of know, so to see how this minority situation, minority protection evolved from the 2000 until now. And this is something that can think about it, whether it's feasible, but I would say that from my point of view, it would be really important to have this treasure of articles made available to the public. But otherwise, it's emails they're buried. It's a bit.
We had something similar for our anniversary in ECMI for 25th anniversary.
It's online.
It's online, yeah.
Exactly.
It's online. But it's not only for the yearbook or different publications.
So it was a very good idea.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to remember that the concept of a yearbook is from the legal field. And the persons that originally started the yearbook were scholars of the law, and it was sort of the idea then. I don't know how many yearbooks there are left now in the publishing industry, but there are still some very phenomenal yearbooks that are important, and I think it, in a sense, I see the European Yearbook as a historical sort of artifact that should have the right to survive, but with then seminal good articles. I mean, obviously, you don't want polemic discussions in a yearbook because it takes a long time to get it through publishing. So I think it's important to select then precisely some articles written by scholars who are really scholars in their field and then can be given down to the next generations in a sense in the archive function that they will still be there, of course, both online and in paper, but and then do more polemic and less scientific things in other places. And I think it's important to keep the scientific standard high, because then the articles will live longer, and the yearbook will live longer.
I concur.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you say you're already doing that, and I hadn't, I should have taken time to check before. But I mean, something like there's something we do with our in-house journal in Glasgow, which is primarily subscription-based. But we have occasional virtual special issues where someone would curate a collection of articles from going right back to the start of the journal in 1949 in some cases, but usually a bit more recent than that. The Russian Revolution, we had one on the Russian Revolution, for example, that had articles from the 1950s that are still landmarks. But yeah, something like that I think would be really valuable. I just wondered what if you look at kind of sales figures and distribution availability, how has that held up over time? Is it remained fairly constant? Are libraries still buying it?
Slow.
Yeah, good. Great.
Do we have any question online? Okay, then please, I open the floor here for comments both on minority issues and also the yearbook. So please, floor is now
Is there
yours.
anybody who published the yearbook in the audience? So I have a potential pool of authors.
We have Yearbook of Talk, we have, I don't know where Martin Block was.
We must have it.
I mean, I just want to make the point that I would reiterate the access issue because, I mean, I'll be honest, like I would seem to be the key audience for such a thing. But, when Ljubica asked me maybe to comment as well, I was also pretty overstretched today. But I had to say, well, honestly, I don't think I would ever read one because I've never had access to it. I mean, I guess I probably did when I was visiting Glasgow, but I had other things to do. I mean, my point is, right, that, I've seen ones that looked interesting. I think I've seen chapters that excited me, but I was never able to access them. Well, I mean, I wasn't willing to spend the whatever, $30, $40 for a chapter. I mean, so I do think, that there's important parts of your key audience who's probably missing because I've never been able to read it. Or, and I'm at a small public university and it's hard enough to get them to buy, like, Cornell University press books and more obscure European presses. So just throwing that out there.
Other question or comment? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think, of course, there's a lot of focus on minority rights, but I do believe that we should expand a little bit focus, talking about human security and democratic consolidation. For instance, what about discrimination? I'm part of a community which is discriminated at the European level. I'm together with Bulgarians, we are not in the Schengen space, and this is a clear case of discrimination. We should perhaps, and should be some approach the issue of chauvinistic policies of Austria and positive discrimination of Croatia in this respect. I mean, this is also part of things that we should be concerned with, because it's also something that concerns us as part of the European Union. It's about human security. human security also it's a part of protecting. I'm in minority at European level, parts of minority discriminate in this. I just been discriminated going to Poland. Romanians and Bulgarians are going to a different procedure in order to get admitted in Poland. This, I think, should also be of concern to us. Although it seems that Romania as a part, of course, have a responsibility in protecting Hungarian minorities and not the Roma minority, but the issue of discrimination should not be avoided, I think. This is my opinion.
Sure, it goes, although from more minority perspective, but to propose issues like equality, discrimination, but also personal scope and so on. So variety, diversity management in more general, diversity within the EU and so are topics which have been covered with within the yearbook. Any other? If not, then we are really on time. Yes.
Yeah.
And so we first thank you very much for this very fruitful and nice discussion. With the courtesy of European Center for Minority Issues, the sign of Professor Galopetoi, I'm really happy to invite you to